Welcome, I'm Becky Bruce here again with Dave Cawley to talk about Season 3 of Cold. Right now we're talking about Episode 3.
Yeah.
And wow, there's a lot of ground that gets covered in this episode. But since we were just talking about having met Jack Bell for the first time, the lead detective in the case of Sheree Warren's disappearance, I thought I'd start there.
Okay.
It seems like in this episode, Jack kind of seems to pick up on the idea that Cary Hartman is manipulating him. But first, he's really suspecting Sheree's estranged husband.
Yeah.
So at what point did Jack really begin to realize that he was being used?
I definitely think this was a process for Detective Jack Bell. And to kind of set the scene a little bit, when Sheree Warren disappeared in October of 1985, her estranged husband, Charles Warren, Chuck Warren as he was better known, really became the focal point of the investigation. And I think that's almost a trope that we see in a lot of crime cases, right? The person closest to the missing person is pretty often going to be the lead suspect, and especially if it's, the romantic partner of a woman who's disappeared. So Chuck Warren becomes the real focal point, but he isn't doing much to help himself in this regard either. He is not cooperative with the investigation. He declines to take a polygraph. He hires a lawyer, which is all fine. But in the eyes of law enforcement, it does kind of elevate their suspicion that he might have been involved in Sheree's disappearance. They know that there's this unresolved divorce that's going on. There's been a fight over alimony. There's even a story about Chuck coming into Sheree's workplace with, maybe a gun tucked behind his coat and making some threatening comments. Really concerning stuff. What begins to happen, though, is Detective Jack Bell learns that Sheree had been dating a man while separated from her husband, and this man was named Cary Hartmann. Cary Hartmann was kind of the polar opposite to Chuck Warren. He was printing up flyers and taking them around town and, trying to talk to anybody and everybody he could about help us find Sheree. There's this reward out there. He's talking to the newspaper. So radically different kind of approach. And Carrie even goes so far as to hire a private investigator. And he records a statement for this private investigator that ends up being transcribed that we have a copy of. So in episode 3 of season 3, through a voice actor, we hear what Cary Hartmann had to say about Sheree Warren's disappearance. And one of the things that really stood out to me, and I think stood out to Detective Jack Bell, is that Carrie keeps kind of pushing the investigation toward Sheree's estranged husband, Chuck Warren. So Jack Bell sees that, he's aware of it, and yeah, he has reason to believe that maybe Chuck was involved. But as time goes on, he begins to also suspect Cary Hartmann for reasons that I imagine you'll want to ask about.
I guess maybe that's a nice segue. How did he start to connect those dots?
So I think a couple of things took place. One is, Cary, he was saying things to Jack Bell that didn't quite line up. Timeline-wise, he, made some statements about making phone calls to Sheree's parents that were different than what Sheree's parents were saying. But what really elevated the concern was a discovery by police in neighboring Ogden, Utah, in a sexual assault case. So the Ogden City Police Department had been for several years looking for a serial rapist, a man who had been breaking into women's homes at night, threatening to kill their children if they didn't comply with his demands. And through evidence that we hear in episode 3, they began to look at Cary Hartmann as a suspect in this case. And so when Cary Hartmann's name came up in connection with this Ogden City rapist investigation and Detective Jack Bell learned about that, it made him kind of begin to refocus and question everything that Cary Hartmann had told him about Sheree's case up to that point.
Was there anything, I want to get back to the rape victims here in a second because I felt like you handled that in a very unique way that I appreciated. But was there anything that stood out to you about Cary's word choice in that transcript?
So much. So this transcript of this statement that Cary gave to his private investigator ends up being 15 or 16 pages long. And he never talks about Sheree in a way that makes me think he cared much about her at all. Now, he says things like that little lady, he almost struggles to mention her by name. He talks about how much she was in love with him. I had to cringe chuckle at one point because he talks about, she came down to a family gathering and she popped up and was doing the dishes. And that's, just what a great little lady she was. And it, in my ear, sounded so much like a young Josh Powell talking about, Susan Cox, later Susan Powell from Cold Season 1. It's like a pre-echo in this weird way. So, yeah, the word choice, the language that Cary used in this statement was a little bizarre to my ear.
Let's talk about some of the other things that we learned from that transcript. What is going on with all the psychic tips?
Oh, my word. So one of the through lines that we see in the Sheree Warren case is from the very early days, there are a number of tips or leads that are presented to police having to do with people having dreams or psychic visions. Detective Jack Bell comes to believe that these are probably originating with Cary Hartman, but we don't know the truth of that. One of these was a coworker of Cary's. Cary said, I talked to this coworker. He had a dream about Sheree. Sheree was lured into the mountains by two men and killed. And here's how, my friend said it happened. Around that same period of time, KSL, the station that we work for, actually received an anonymous letter in the mail, which had, a hand drawing of Sheree's face, mentioned her car, talked to, about her again being lured into the mountains by, men. So similar in a way that would make a person, I think a skeptic, question whether these were coming from the same place, potentially. They don't tell us much as far as evidence in the case. There's nothing specific enough about where one might go look for Sheree, but they do cause, again, Detective Jack Bell to think more critically about Cary Hartman and question whether these psychic tips and leads might have been coming from Cary.
Okay, so to go back to the rape investigation, or I should say rapes investigations, you have a really unique choice, I think, in the storytelling here, where you start to tell us about their assaults, and then you say, I'm not going to go into further detail. Mm-hmm. What led to that decision?
So in the research for the Sheree Warren case, looking at Cary Hartman, because we know he's a suspect in Sheree's disappearance, it became necessary to look at the other criminal conduct that he was potentially involved in. So yes, in 1987, Cary becomes a suspect in this serial rape investigation. I went and obtained all of the records that I could from these various cases that he was suspected in or charged in. He ends up being convicted on one, which we know comes in a later episode. But in reviewing those case records, I was able to, read the accounts of these women who were assaulted. I, knew the detail by detail way that they described these assaults playing out. And journalistically, there is a balance that I believe it's important to strike between telling a complete story, giving the public the relevant information to understand the truth of what was happening, while also protecting the individual privacy of these women, of these victims. And I reached out to a couple of them who were most closely associated with the crimes that Cary ended up being convicted on. They didn't respond, which is fine. But because they didn't respond and couldn't consent to talking about those very specific, intimate details of those assaults, I felt it was necessary to draw a line and basically say, I've taken you this far with me in this story. I'm going to need to ask your trust as a listener that I've done the work of reading the rest of this report, but this is where we're going to stop. I will tell you that the circumstances that these women describe are consistent between them because that's necessary to understand, the serial nature of this crime. But beyond that, we're not going to be prying into these women's, traumatic experiences without a clear reason to do so.
Well, I imagine that we probably have some listeners who also appreciated that approach as well. Let me ask you one last thing about this episode, and then we'll wrap it up here. And that is, at what point did police really begin to think, could the stuff in Salt Lake City, those missing women, be connected with what was going on in Ogden?
Yeah, so one of the really fascinating things when you're looking at this serial rape case out of Ogden City, as the Ogden City Police Department begins to develop suspects, they begin to look at Cary Hartman. At the same time, 30 or 40 miles south in Salt Lake City, another police department is looking at a series of cases involving missing and murdered women. 3 of their cases in Salt Lake are tied together by ballistics, they believe, to a single gun. And that is believed to be a .357 or a .38. Well, Cary Hartman was known to have a .38 and a .357. So the question became, could these two things be one and the same? It was a period of time where I think police in a lot of places were very interested in serial crimes. Ted Bundy was a few years away from his execution. That was coloring a lot of the perspectives of investigators all over the country. And as we go back and kind of look at that in historical context, it makes a lot of sense why investigators were curious as to whether Cary Hartman could have been involved in these, missing and murdered women cases. There's a task force that's formed basically to look into that. And I don't want to get too far ahead of where we will be in the season, but it doesn't go maybe where somebody might think it would go.
That feels like a good place for us to leave it. So if somebody wants to find out the rest of the details, I would encourage them to listen to your podcast. Where can they find it? Cold Season 3 is available right now wherever you get your podcasts. It's also available to binge. All episodes available on Amazon Music.